People who inspire. That's what the Profiles in Philanthropy from Rainmakers TV is all about, and we have someone who is very inspirational, Phyllis Campbell. Phyllis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
I was going to introduce you as Phyllis Campbell from Chase Bank, or Phyllis Campbell from Seattle Foundation, or Phyllis Campbell from... You have had a wonderful career, haven't you?
Well, I've been very lucky, Stan. I have to tell you, I feel that I have ended up being at the right place at the right time where I needed to be. And most of my career, as you know, has been in commercial banking, including today. But I did take that 5-year stint or hiatus, or whatever you want to call it, from 2003 to 2008 to run the Seattle Foundation, which was a wonderfully rewarding experience, but one that was totally unexpected.
Well, I actually kind of want to focus in on that just for a minute or two, if I could. You went from the commercial finance world into a foundation, a nonprofit that helps the poor out. Mm-hmm. Was it a big jump for you?
Well, I was on the board, so that helped. The Seattle Foundation, many people may or may not know, but it is our community foundation. Seattle Foundation then works with donors in the community, many who don't want to have their own foundations but need the services of a community foundation. But in many cases, to pool the philanthropy to, you're right, give to nonprofits, but not just in health and human services, but education, economy, all of arts, all of the different areas that impact a better community. So the broad and the breadth and scope and the broad nature of what the Seattle Foundation does appealed to me. But you're right, it was a big jump. I left banking in 2001 thinking I wanted to run a business because I've always been a business person. And so I did not see the Seattle Foundation running a nonprofit in my future, something that I would do full time, but fate intervened otherwise.
Why did you do it? Why did you go there?
I care about the community. I think if you look through my whole history, both professionally and personally, you'll see that I'm motivated by a healthy community and creating a better community. I believe that business can be an agent for creating that better community. I believe that nonprofits obviously are part of that fabric, philanthropy, everything. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, I was raised to give back and to say, I've been fortunate. I've had a lot of breaks, I've had a lot of mentors, I've had a lot of people that have opened doors for me. And part of the obligation is to turn around and open doors for others and, again, make sure that in the end we all do well, because that's the definition of a healthy community.
All right, well, let's get into that then, because what I really get down to is why did you do the Seattle Foundation experience, we'll call it that. You then talked about the way you were raised. So let's talk about that. What was it about you? Is there any particular moment that you may remember, or a particular series of events that say, when I get the opportunity, I'm going to provide for someone else? Sure.
Well, I'll give you two. One is we came from a pretty poor family. My family was, father's side of the family had been interned as a result of World War II, being Japanese American. So we ended up inland in Spokane. As a result of that, after the war was over, my father worked for a dry cleaners, ended up being a co-owner of it. But I remember in many instances when we didn't have anything, literally it was, how are we going to get food on our table, when my mother would open our doors to people knocking at the door who were more needy than we were, when we would do Christmas baskets for other families who had less. And so it left a powerful impression on me in that, there's always somebody who needs something more than you do. Don't focus on yourself or your own deficits. We had plenty, as it turned out. But the second thing was when we were talking about going to college, which my parents really wanted desperately us to do, I didn't know how I'd do it. And then I opened the mail one day when we had this discussion about how are we going to make the finances work just to go to Washington State University, a public university. And in the mail that day was a check. And it was a check from a private donor. And the check was for enough to, allow me to go to college. And I'll never forget that. And I thought to myself, if I ever could in my life do that for somebody else, because this was a benefactor that I never knew or never got to meet, I would love to do that, because that was the door opener to allow me to go to Washington State University.
And then as you grew in business and were younger at the time, Did you find opportunities for you to lead the businesses that you were involved with in some kind of philanthropic efforts?
Well, I was also lucky to have an early mentor at my first bank, which was the predecessor to U.S. Bank in Spokane, Dave Clack. He's the chairman, and he always used to say, the more you give, the more you get back. It's an unending cycle. And what he meant was that businesses only do as well as the community does. Therefore, it's important to always put back, as much, maybe even more than you take out of a community. And so he would give us opportunities as young officers to volunteer, to lead boards, to get involved in the political process. His whole thesis was just get involved and use your personal time. If you can write a check, do it. Get out and vote, but run for political PC. I ran for precinct committee person one time. I think I lost, but that's all right. It just was part of the process of getting involved. So yes, I do remember a couple of things when I was asked to step up to be the head of a community chamber, and I was very young, very inexperienced, the youngest person on the board. But I again remember that Dave would challenge us. It's important to get involved. Step up where you can. Step up to those opportunities. So being part of the chamber, being the treasurer of the American Red Cross in the Northwest chapter, I took on all those responsibilities early on in my career, and I found that I grew. I enjoyed it as much as I gave.
Okay, so you said you got something back as much as you gave. What did you get back? How did you grow?
Okay, well, I think first of all, it's psychic satisfaction. People underestimate that, and I do think that's one of the reasons you do it, is something you care about is better because you put the time and energy, and that's a real, I think, important part of a person's satisfaction in life. But the other side of it is it challenges you. When you're sitting on a board at age 28 years old, a board of very seasoned people, you learn from governance, from those experienced board members. They push you, you push yourself. You learn about a lot of things that maybe you don't get the opportunity to see, and you learn about your community. So I really was lucky. It gave me a view into Spokane, and in many cases the side of Spokane that I maybe normally wouldn't see in my drive from home to work and back. And I learned there were a lot of community needs out there. So those are probably a couple practical examples.
No, very, very good ones. We're very fortunate to have Phyllis Campbell with us today, right here on the Rainmakers TV's Profiles in Philanthropy. In Profiles in Philanthropy, what we're doing is finding those people who are inspiring, finding those people who have seen that there is a value in giving back. And with Phyllis Campbell, we are very fortunate to be able to have someone who fits every bit of a profile in philanthropy. So if you want to see more of this series, be sure to stay tuned to www.rainmakers.tv. You said something very interesting. You got to see a part of Spokane through your philanthropic work that you wouldn't have otherwise seen. What did that mean to you?
It was just awareness raising. As I mentioned, I grew up with not a lot, so I understood where certain sides of the community are when you don't have a lot of money, and that's how I was raised. You do a lot more with less, but you also need the help of nonprofits and great neighbors and churches and so on. So I got that growing up, and I remember again as a youngster going to the YMCA in Spokane and swimming at the pool in downtown. So all those things remind me that the communities have needs and people have needs that you don't see. But sometimes when you get into a business, into an office tower, into a home in the suburbs, for no fault of your own, you drive out of your garage, you lock the door, you drive into your parking garage at work, and you deal with the things you deal with in business. You don't always get a chance to remind yourself that there's a whole other side of our community. So I think it's important.
It's a perfect segue into this question. Why should business care? I mean, as you grew in business and you had a bottom line that you had to be responsible for, why should you care about somebody who was never going to buy from you?
Sure. Well, again, back to the thesis that a community is only healthy if all parts of the community are healthy. I think you have to start there and say it's an important obligation for business, for leaders, for all of us to think about the entire community. And again, through no fault, I think, of a lot of people, you don't get a chance to see a lot of the sides of the community where, you know, there's immigration, where there's high poverty, where kids aren't graduating from even high school, nonetheless having an opportunity to go to college. So you don't often get exposed to that. And I think it's really important to, first of all, start from the philosophy that you've got to have a healthy community in all your neighborhoods, in all areas. And then if you start there, then you say, okay, now it's my job to go out and find out what are those needs, what's going on, where are their problems. And, you know, back to my Seattle Foundation, that gave me a tremendous exposure, obviously, to this community here in Puget Sound.
You were awarded the Woman of Spirit Award from the Red Cross. What was that for?
Well, I was very flattered by that because, as I mentioned, my first nonprofit was, one of my first ones was volunteering as the treasurer for the American Red Cross in Spokane. So when they called me up and told me that I was selected for this award, what they told me, which was very, very humbling, was because I care and because I, as an individual, not just through the Seattle Foundation, which was an obvious vehicle, but because I personally had spent my life volunteering, caring, giving back, and again, making sure that we have this healthy community, they chose me for this particular distinction. So I have to say I was very flattered, but again, it was a nice award, but it was for doing what I think everybody should do.
You were the leader of you know, one of the strongest banks in the area at a time when you took some time off. And then you went to the Seattle Foundation. When you decided, made that change, what were your goals at the Seattle Foundation?
Well, I was hired by the board. I competed. I stepped off the board, and I competed with, I was told, 100 other national candidates for that job. So we were lucky in Seattle to be able to attract that many wonderful people. But I knew I had to come in with a perspective, a platform, if you will. And my platform really was pretty simple. First of all, in order for a great nonprofit, a community foundation, to grow and do well and increase its scope and impact, you have to have a good underlying business model. So I said, you know, I'm a business person. I know this is a nonprofit and a community foundation that's about the community, so the values piece is paramount. But I also understand how to run a great organization by having good business principles underlying an organization. Give me some time to assess the systems, the processes, the technology, the people, and really make sure that we have the platform on which to scale a great community foundation. So that was number one. I think the board was really impressed, or at least appealed. What appealed was the business background that I brought to the table. But the second vision was, we've got a great community here for philanthropy. This community foundation is $300 million in total charitable assets. It ought to be $600 million or more. And so I think they made me make a commitment to say I'd grow it to $1 billion. They didn't tell me how many years I had, so that was at least a little bit of a reprieve. But I think the important thing is, you know, we ought to be in this community. We ought to have philanthropic vehicles that allow people to pool their philanthropy, to channel it into areas of the greatest need, and that's really what the Seattle Foundation does well.
When you became the head of the Seattle Foundation, of course, that's at a time where you're essentially writing checks to many, many, many people with their hands out. Probably many more had their hands out or were asking for some type of funding than what you could say yes to. How'd you decide who to say yes to?
Well, that's the beauty of the Seattle Foundation. Obviously, it's a community foundation that's been here for a very long time in this community, and you have great staff. So you have a great institutional memory of people over 70 plus years who have developed an amazing history of nonprofits and the needs and know which ones are most effective, and that's again what the Community Foundation provides. I also inherited from Ann Farrell, who was my predecessor, a fantastic staff. People that really were walking encyclopedias on effective nonprofits, effective causes, places to fund. And so when we worked with donors and I walked in the door, that team was already there. And so working with those folks, I have to say, I learned a lot, things I didn't know. I'd been a previous United Way campaign chair, so I knew a fair amount about health and human services. But I didn't know a lot about the arts scene, about the environmental, the economy, education, a lot of things that really opened my eyes because, you know, we had a great team that helped educate me and the donors of the Seattle Foundation.
We're very fortunate to have Phyllis Campbell with us right here on Profiles in Philanthropy from Rainmakers TV. She is the former head of the Seattle Foundation and is now back in the banking business. But what she is talking about is ways that there are actually similarities between nonprofits and for-profits. And let's actually get right into that. The similarities that there are between for-profits and not-for-profits in terms of their business approach. You said that you wanted to take a business head into the Seattle Foundation. Now, having been on both sides of that scale, what's the good parts and what are the parts that need improvement in the nonprofit world?
I do think there are lots of overlaps and there's a convergence between the two sectors. So I am one of those that say there's much more similar than there are differences. The differences we know in business is there's usually a measurable bottom line, particularly in publicly traded companies. But I do think that nonprofits need to pay a lot more attention to that dashboard. What are we trying to do here? How do we know? What are the outcomes? And it sometimes is an overused word, and it makes people bristle a little bit because nonprofits rightfully say we're about values and mission, and we're about the long term. And I get that. I think that's very important. But I also think the page they can take out of the business book is you need to still quantify what you do, how you do it, and efficiency, yes, but most of all, effectiveness. How do you know you're effective at the end of the day, and what does your scorecard tell you? So I do think I encouraged us at the Seattle Foundation to each have individual goals. We had performance reviews. We had a lot of things that said we are accountable to our donors. The donors pay our bill. They pay the fees on their funds. So at the end of the day, we've got to give an accounting to our donors of what you do, how you do it, and how you know in the long run you're making effective change in this healthy community construct. So I think we did a lot to move the Seattle Foundation while I was there towards that thinking. I think there are a lot of nonprofits that can benefit from that kind of thinking. I think donors are going to insist upon it more and more, especially the donors who have been business people, which many have. So I guess my takeaway is work at it. It's not impossible. It's hard, but it can be done. And in the end, showing accountability is probably, and transparency are two very important things.
Okay, now here's the question I'm going to ask that's going to get you in trouble. If someone were to ask you, okay, so what are the nonprofits that I should be giving to? What are the ones that you give to or that are you're particularly fond of?
Sure. Well, I'll start with higher ed because it goes back to my scholarship story of being a beneficiary of a wonderful scholarship check myself. So one of the first things my husband and I did was establish a scholarship fund at Washington State University, which we still fund and have endowed. We get letters from the students, which is wonderful. So that's probably one of my personal favorites, only in that I think it illustrates the cycle of giving well, is that you get to go back and maybe help some young person as I was helped way back when. But I think the other ones that have been personal favorites, I have several categories, domestic and global. Domestically, I tend to lean towards the health and human services organizations. So Asian Counseling and Referral Services, ACRS, helps Asian immigrant populations with assimilation as well as on-the-ground practical services. We gave a large contribution to their capital campaign. But I love going there, meeting with the staff, seeing what they do, volunteering with some of our colleagues and their activities. Those kinds of things really mean a lot to me because it just shows the open door side of our community and I think helps these populations that we've talked about. The other global side is I really am so happy that our region has focused on Seattle being a nucleus for looking at global poverty alleviation. I mean, what better place with the Gates Foundation right here? So I've been involved with the Initiative for Global Development on the board. I'm involved with PATH. Many people know that, great organization. Mm-hmm. So those two nonprofits are a little bit more current involvement simply because I think we can work on domestic and global poverty at the same time. We've got a lot of great learnings, and again, I think there's a lot of things we can do, especially from Seattle.
There's a wonderful short article about you at Washington State University, and the headline is fantastic. Phyllis Campbell, Being About Forever. Headline writers read the article first. What did they find in there that was being about forever from Phyllis Campbell?
Wow, that's an interesting one. I can't get inside their head, but I guess what I would say is it is about the community being forever. So when we turn around, I think we should always ask ourselves, what's the legacy that we are creating and leaving behind? I suspect that might have been part of what they were looking at. Was I always like to think I've had a lot of great success, a lot of great breaks, but it isn't about me, and it isn't about another award or another article. It's about what you turn around and leave behind. So the forever is, let's think about our kids. That's been my interest in higher ed, opening doors for other kids who maybe wouldn't have that open door. And that to me then transcends the generational thing. And that's to me the forever is you turn around and you hope when you leave this world that you've left it in better shape via the younger people who are the next 2 or 3 generations behind.
All right, let's go to where you're a student at some university, let's say probably Washington State University, who has been the recipient of some scholarship funds through something that you have done. And that student calls you up and is able to get hold of you and say, okay, I'm getting ready to start my career in business. How should I merge philanthropy in with my business life? What should I do? What would you tell them?
Well, I do a lot of mentoring, so I get that question a lot, actually. And here's generally what I tell young people today, because one thing I find, and I'm just really heartened by this, young people are really giving back, wanting to give back and wanting to make a difference. So the current cohort, for anything that anybody has that's bad to say about it, I have nothing but good to say. I love the young people that are in high school, college today because they want to make a difference. So I always say never lose that passion, that you, however, ought to maybe get into business first or get into a profession first, learn the basics of how you run a business, what makes the economy work, make some money, not a lot, but just a little bit of money, and then simultaneously go ahead and volunteer. You can volunteer, that's great. Always volunteer, always do things that you can do to give back. But if you want to run a nonprofit, it would be great to have a little background, a little business kind of principles under your belt, and then go out and run that great organization that will make a difference as a nonprofit. So it's not maybe as linear as it sounds, but I really like to encourage people to make sure they get a little bit of time, at least in a business, small, medium, or large, before they go out and want to change the world and run that wonderful nonprofit.
As we wrap this up, you talked about encouraging people to volunteer as well, that volunteering is something that they can always do. What's been your favorite volunteering experience?
Well, there are so many. I guess I have loved being on the governing boards of universities, and that I know is maybe not the classic volunteer job, but part of what I've realized over time is I enjoy good governance and governance principles, and that a board is really important to the effective functioning of an organization. So my history has been, as you probably saw from my resume, being very involved in boards of nonprofits, of higher ed institutions, and of companies. I think it's something I'm not just interested in, but I'm passionate about it, that good governance makes a difference. So I've been on the board of Washington State University, just finished a 12-year stint at Seattle University. So I guess my favorite experience, though, has maybe been as a trustee of Seattle U, because of its mission, because of opening doors for kids, and when they say empowering leaders for a just and humane world, what a great, great mission and a great convergence in encouraging young people to make that difference.
We'll let that be the last word. Phyllis Campbell, thank you very much for being a part
Stan.
of Profiles in Philanthropy.
You're welcome.
And with that, Rainmakers.tv is a place where you can find all of our Profiles in Philanthropy interviews, certainly none better than with Phyllis Campbell. Take care.